Hello, today we're going to have a look at the question, evaluate the view that moderates dominate the Democratic Party. Again, if you see the phrase moderates dominating, like in this one, it basically means the DLC, the New Democrat faction. If it was the phrase liberals, it will mean the progressive left, and if you see the phrase conservatives, it will mean the Blue Dogs. So, generally, we're going to look at three main areas because the exam specification highlights the economy, social welfare, morals, which also include crime. So these will be the three areas which we will focus on. So I'm going to argue that yes, the moderates do tend to dominate the Democratic Party. They tend to see off some of the more extreme views of the progressive left or the liberals, and they also tend to see off some of the views of the conservatives or the Blue Dogs. So, on the economy, first of all, so moderate Democrats, the DLC, New Democrats, whatever it is you want to call them, they do believe in some state intervention in the economy. They do generally believe in the free market. They do generally believe in some protections of consumers and US citizens from that free market. Now, if you look at some policies, you could argue that yes, the moderates do tend to win out on this area. So, for example, we look at Joe Biden's time as president. He introduced the America Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. Both of these stimulus packages were quite large. So, for example, the America Rescue Plan was $1.9 trillion. The Inflation Reduction Act, in its final version, came to, I lost my notes, about $800 million, something of that nature. So these are quite large stimulus packages. However, you could say that they are moderate because some of them, like the Inflation Reduction Act, was cut back in order to get it approved by the Conservatives. It's in particular Senator Joe Manchin, who feared that it was too big. And some of those on the progressive left would have liked these stimulus packages to have been greater. And therefore, you could argue it has that Goldilocks kind of role of being somewhere in the middle. Similar situation under Obama. So Obama does a stimulus package called the Recovery Act, following the financial crash, which was $831 billion. And this was on the back of a similar sized stimulus package done by his Republican predecessor, George W. Bush. And again, some of those on the left would have liked it to have gone further. So generally speaking, you could argue it did kind of pave that kind of middle way, if you so like. In other areas, you could also say that the moderates tend to win out. So moderates and conservatives tend to like the free market and free trade. And again, things like Obama signing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. This was a free trade agreement between the United States and Southeast Asia. And this fits in with the moderate view of the free market, fits in with the conservatives. However, some of the progressive left didn't like it. They saw it as potentially taking away American jobs, and therefore it did not go far enough, if you like, or it went too far, I suppose, for some of the progressive left who did not like it and voted against it and criticised it afterwards as well. You've also got other areas of the economy which you could say have taken the middle ground. So you could argue, for example, that Obama's reform of Wall Street, the Dodd Act, following the financial crash, again, for the progressive left, they would have liked greater regulation of the finance industry following the financial crash. The conservatives within the Democrats, the Blue Dogs, didn't really want a huge amount of legislation restricting Wall Street. So again, you could argue that the Dodd Act was kind of this middle ground and therefore suggest that the moderates kind of win out. So in these regards, I think you could argue that that pragmatic, moderate centre ground of the Democrat Party tends to win out. The stimulus packages were a pragmatic response to the financial crash and COVID, and again, perhaps not too great or too little. You could argue the Dodd Act was a pragmatic approach to the financial crash and again provided some reform of the financial industry, but not enough to cause as the Conservatives would see, real harm to the financial market. And therefore, you could argue that the Democrats are controlled by the moderates when it comes to the economy. However, you could argue this is not entirely true, and actually the other factions have greater leverage over the Democratic Party. So, for example, you could say that the Conservative faction, the Blue Dogs, tend to win out more often than not. So, for example, we mentioned before Joe Biden wanted to pass the Inflation Reduction Act. This was a much weaker version than his original intention. The original intention was for far more spending to be done on infrastructure, green energy. This was largely blocked and delayed and eventually watered down by a handful of conservative Democrats, led in particular by Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. His state was a coal-producing state. A lot of the green energy stuff didn't really match his state, and he feared it would lose jobs in his state. So therefore, he opposed it, and he opposed it for over 12 months. And the reason why the Conservatives perhaps had such influence over this legislation and managed to water it down so much was because the Democrats only had a small majority in the Senate, and therefore they were reliant upon the votes of people like Joe Manchin to get it through. And this would therefore suggest that the Conservative faction was winning out. Many on the progressive left were also very upset and appalled when Joe Biden gave permission to start drilling for oil in the Willow Oil Project, which was in the north of Alaska. Again, this seems to go against the environmental protections, which those on the progressive left seem to like. And it seemed to be contrary, they thought, to what Joe Biden had been doing on the environment. However, you could also argue that actually no, the progressive left also win out on some aspects of economic policy as well. So, for example, for many conservatives, some of those stimulus packages under Biden were too great. Obviously they opposed the Inflation Reduction Act, but some of the big stimulus package on the American Rescue Plan, for example, you could argue this $1.9 trillion in the American Rescue Plan, you could say it actually did feed into inflation, which brought down the problem for the later Biden years. And again, some of the conservatives were a bit concerned when it came to passing this piece of legislation. You could argue that the progressive left won out as well when Joe Biden increased the federal minimum wage to $17.75, which was quite a big increase. And therefore, this might show that the progressive left are actually much more in charge. Interestingly, which again might please the progressive left, I suppose, more than other factions, is the fact that Joe Biden is the only president, or certainly the only president in recent times, to actually go to a picket line of industrial workers, again trying to show his support for the unions and the interests of workers. So throughout all of this, I still think that overall the moderates are in charge. You've got the progressive left who are often pushing for greater stimulus packages, greater minimum wages, greater environmental protections. You've got the conservative Blue Dog faction who often are much more sceptical about some aspects of the climate change stuff, often are worried about big stimulus packages and who's going to pay for them. And therefore you could argue that what you end up with in the Democrats is this middle way where you do get stimulus packages but they're acceptable enough to the conservatives but also to many of the progressive left. You do get some regulations of like environmental regulation and financial regulations, but again they're not too strong to fear to really kind of undermine the views of the conservatives. And therefore the middle way is often the end product of what many Democrat presidents tend to do when it comes to the economy. Okay, so the next paragraph is on social welfare. So again, it's a similar story to the economy in many ways. You often get the progressive left want the president, Democrat tend to go a lot further. The conservative faction, the Blue Dogs, often fear that will take it too far, and so you tend to get this moderate middle way is the way that tends to win out. And you can see that through recent policies. So perhaps the most famous or biggest social welfare program of recent years has been Obamacare, otherwise known as the Affordable Care Act. Quite an old example now, going back to 2009. but it kind of epitomises or shows this kind of steering this middle ground. So for some progressives, it didn't go far enough. So one of the current chairs of the progressive left, she wants to have much more of a NHS type of situation. She wants mandatory kind of free kind of healthcare for people. And then of course you get many of the conservative blue dogs who don't want to spend too much on healthcare and do worry about over-regulation, and they support the private market, which they currently have. And Obamacare kind of straddles this middle way. So things like abortions are not paid for under Obamacare. The insurance model is still in place. Some of the elements which the Conservatives didn't like, for example, making mandatory, disappeared as well. So Obamacare kind of fits this middle ground. You also see it with Joe Biden and prescription charges. So Joe Biden tried to reduce the price of certain drugs on prescriptions, things like insulin and stuff. Again, the progressive left would have liked them to have gone further and included more drugs to have these lower prices. Again, many on the conservative blue dog end worried about the cost of this, and therefore you could say that this middle ground was kind of achieved as well. And so these welfare provisions, you might argue, therefore, suggest that Biden and Obama, and therefore the recent Democrat Party, have kind of steered this middle way, if you like, when it comes to social welfare. However, you could argue that's not entirely true, actually. There's been some wins for the progressive left, and there've also been some wins, if you like, for the Conservatives. So, for example, for the progressive left winning out, Joe Biden did pass the Social Security Fairness Act, which expanded Social Security benefits quite substantially. So again, that tended to please those on the progressive left. However, those on the Conservative side, they point out things like, they dislike Joe Biden trying to cancel student loan debt. Again, they feared for the costs of this, and so when the Supreme Court rejected it, they were quite pleased. And Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, who's one of the current chairs of the Blue Dogs, she voted against cancelling student debt. You could argue as well that the Conservatives have won out with Obamacare ultimately, because abortion was not paid for under Obamacare. They didn't get as strong as even Obama wanted, and therefore this would all suggest that the Conservative faction has perhaps won out when it comes to social welfare programs. And of course, you could also say they've won out because the minimum wage is only for federal workers, not for those in the private sector. So again, perhaps not as radical as those on the progressive left would certainly have liked. Okay, the third area is on morals, which also, according to the exam specification, includes crime as well, and therefore immigration. And again, I would argue a little bit like the other two paragraphs. I think the moderates do tend to win out because, again, the progressive left would always like them to go further, and the Conservatives would like them not to go as far. In terms of things like abortion and gay marriage, though, the moderate view, the moderate Democrats, is not really that dissimilar, I don't think, especially to the progressive left and many Conservatives as well. So most Democrats, with the odd exception, are pro-choice, and so therefore the position of the moderates is in line with the progressive left and most of those moderates. So they all supported Obama and Biden appointing liberal Supreme Court judges who were pro-choice. I believe all Democrats voted in favour of the Respect for Marriage Act, which put into federal law the right to have gay marriage. They were clearly fearing that the Supreme Court might strike down Obergefell versus Hodges. All Democrats as well voted against in 2025 a bill which would have banned trans women and girls from taking part in women's sport. Again, these might be things which the progressive left were kind of pushing for, but the fact moderates also accepted these things, and also so did the Conservative Democrats, suggests actually that all Democrats will support these things. But again, the moderates were definitely in the driving seat behind this. Where the progressive left perhaps don't win out as much as they would like is over things like crime. So the moderates and the conservatives tend to be tougher on crime. And again, you can see this middle way sometimes. So, on gun restrictions and gun laws, for example, many of the conservative Democrats, the Blue Dogs, they're concerned about gun regulations. They like the Second Amendment. It fits into their more conservative kind of views. The progressive left, they see the need for greater gun regulations. And so, again, this middle way can be found. So, like Biden passed a bipartisan piece of legislation called the Community Safety Act. I think it was in 2023, if memory serves me right. This was some gun regulation, but you could say it does the middle ground. So for the progressive left, it does provide more money towards mental health. It did ban ghost guns, which are those which apparently you can assemble yourselves or something. Okay, and it did put some more money into like prevention and education around guns, which the progressive left quite liked. However, for them it didn't go far enough. Okay, they would like greater restrictions on guns. For the Conservatives and also for Republicans who supported it, again, it didn't kind of attack assault guns or anything like this. So again, it wasn't infringing too much on people's Second Amendment rights. And again, they could sign up to some of the issues around mental health. And therefore it fitted into this middle ground, and therefore would suggest that the moderates are the group which tends to win out. Moderates as well are much more likely, along with their conservative friends, to believe in tougher sentences for crime. They tend to favour things like the death penalty, for example. Again, not all of them do. They tend to support tougher measures against immigration. So, again, if you take someone like John Fetterman, who is the senator for Pennsylvania, he has said, for example, that on issues of immigration, he's actually does take a tougher line on the issue with the border with Mexico. But he calls himself a progressive in many other areas. So, again, perhaps the moderate line in America on immigration is to be tougher about that border. And perhaps some of the attempts to do reforms on immigration. So Biden did try, for example, to give citizenship to certain groups and try to deal with the border. Barack Obama also tried with the DREAM Act and various other executive orders to try and have a more pragmatic approach to the border. So for like Obama, for example, he deported more Hispanics than any other president, but he also tried to do these executive orders to give citizenship to certain groups, especially those whose families were born, some born in the United States, some born in Mexico, to give a path to citizenship for those who were born in Mexico from the same family. So again, taking that moderate, pragmatic centre ground within the Democratic Party. Not far enough for the left, probably a little bit too far for some of those on the more conservative side of the party. However, the counterpoint might be, and also on that same point, so just going back slightly, back to the moral bit, obviously Biden and the progressive left were appalled by the Supreme Court decision over abortion, which effectively gave it to the states, who many of them banned it. So the Obama government did pass an executive order, it says trying to find, or was it a law, executive order, to say that hospitals had to provide abortion if the life of the mother was in danger, even in those states which have outlawed abortions. Now, the left that did not go far enough, but again, you could argue it's a pragmatic, moderate approach. They weren't going to overturn the Supreme Court decision, so this may have been a pragmatic approach to what do we do in states where they banned abortion, but a mother's life might be in danger. And therefore, you could say that the moderates kind of won out on that one as well. Okay, so the counter argument to say no, the moderates haven't won out on crime or immigration. You could say actually the progressive left are by far the most supportive group of things like abortion rights and gay marriage, and you could argue that they have pushed the Democrat Party to support these things. So looking at gay marriage, for example, it wasn't that long ago, it was only under Clinton's time, when he mentioned something about allowing gay people to join the military. The progressive left were very much in favour of this, other Democrats weren't, and in the end a compromise was made called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Fast forward 10-15 years and you get an Obama, for example, supporting the Supreme Court decision over gay marriage. So clearly the Democrat Party has changed on this issue, but it might reflect the progressive left pushing them possibly, but it might also reflect society changing as well. You do tend to find the progressive left supporting more rehabilitation of prisoners. And again, John Fetterman, who we mentioned before, on immigration is relatively conservative, but actually on something like crime, he's actually much more liberal. He supports greater rehabilitation of prisoners. He also supports as well the sentences to be reviewed of certain types of prisoners as well, saying that some of them are too harsh for certain types of crime. And so again, you're seeing that one person here in one way is a bit conservative in some areas but more liberal in others. So people are not just in silos, so to speak. Obama passed the Fair Sentencing Act. This struck down quite a harsh piece of legislation passed by Bill Clinton, which basically said if you commit a third felony, you get a huge great big long prison sentence. This led to many African Americans serving long prison sentences for quite minor crimes like drug dealing or having so many drugs on them, that type of stuff. And so the Fair Sentencing Act, which you could say was a bit of a liberal reform, and might show a more liberal nature, a more progressive liberal view in terms of crime under Obama in this particular field. So it's a mixed picture, as ever, with all these sorts of things. I'm talking about immigration, sorry. The chair of the Blue Dogs, the conservative faction, Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, she supports Trump building this wall across the Mexican border. And again, the Democrats haven't really, well, they did oppose it in Trump's first term. They've gone a bit quiet of late on this particular issue. But the Democrats have been opposing ICE and some of these deportations, which again might suggest they're more inclined towards a progressive left. Or you might say they're taking a more pragmatic approach. You know, yes, we need to be tough on the border. Yes, we need to police the border. But we don't agree with ICE agents having masks on and deporting whole families. So they've taken, you could argue, this more pragmatic, moderate approach. And therefore might suggest that that is the group which wins out. So overall, my view is that the moderate pragmatists within the Democrat Party do tend to win out. The progressive left often push for greater state intervention in the economy, greater welfare provisions, greater social liberalism. The conservative Blue Dogs often are the opposite, you know, especially on things like the economy and on things like welfare. They often want tougher things on crime. And the compromise which is often made is often that position of those moderate centre ground Democrats. And therefore, I would argue that the moderate Democrats, by and large, are the ones who tend to win out within the Democratic Party.